Hey, it's Kay. And this is Skittles, nuclear physicist. I have to admit, Oppenheimer was a much more interesting film than I expected. I am on record as not thinking very highly of a lot of director Christopher Nolan's work, and indeed Oppenheimer does bear the mark of his fascination with the great and exceptional individual. As viewers, we are shown that Oppenheimer sees in a way others do not, conceptualizing the threads that connect matter itself. He is a special genius. Fascinating, then, is that this is not a film about how great J. Robert Oppenheimer is, it's a film about guilt. Heavily based on the biography American Prometheus, Oppenheimer is far less concerned with the wider political motions of the end of the Second World War and the ramping up of the Cold War than it is with the tumultuous experience of the man himself. While the film follows key historical events, Christopher Nolan has stated in interviews that everything else I really tried to approach as fiction because I feel we're not making a documentary. You can't hide behind authenticity. You have to make an interpretation. That's the job. While there has been a recent spate of films wearing the skin of historical events and figures, while denying any responsibility to historical rigor, which is certainly something I have some opinions on, I am not interested in sitting here and hitting Oppenheimer with a CinemaSins ding for every historical inaccuracy. Instead, let's appraise this film as an interpretation, because it does something kind of daring and does try to explore what is going on in Oppenheimer's head. What led the man who helmed the Manhattan Project to be so against the use and proliferation of the very weapons he worked to create? In his interpretation of Oppenheimer's life, Nolan makes some decisions that are truly excellent, some that are sincerely confounding, and at least one decision that leads this film to completely miss perhaps the most important piece of the puzzle, that is Oppenheimer's guilt.
And I think it's gonna be a long, long time. The touchdown brings me round again to find I'm not the man they think I am.
At the beginning of the film, Oppenheimer is presented very much how you might expect him to be in a Hollywood film. This way of depicting brilliance is not uncommon, but it is kind of silly. Oppenheimer clearly had an aptitude for certain things, but the economic and educational opportunities he had access to, and probably a lot of hard work on his part, might make up a more substantial and interesting aspect of this story than his being born special, which is boring. But there's a different problem with boy genius Oppenheimer that the film seems to struggle with. I'm not the world's biggest Christopher Nolan fan, but he's obviously very skilled at certain aspects of directing. What he is often not very impressive with is his writing.
Love is the one thing we're capable of perceiving that transcends dimensions of time and space.
So you came back to die with your city?
No. I came back to stop you.
Oppenheimer is plagued by what I call the dumb guys writing smart guys effect. Let's look at a couple examples. First is Oppie's lecture at a Netherlands university. The film depicts something that is well accounted for in biographies of the man, that he had a talent for learning languages. He learned Sanskrit to read Hindu religious texts without needing translation, more on that later, and famously, he learned Dutch in just 6 weeks to give this lecture in the Netherlands. Anyone who's learned a second language will know it is incredibly impressive to reach a level of fluency that would allow you to give a technical, scientific lecture in so little time. Wow, big genius boy, right? But in the movie, according to Dutch speakers, something that I am not, his Dutch is incomprehensible. Now, I don't blame Cillian Murphy for this at all. I don't have an exact timescale, but he has made it clear in interviews that he had to learn the Dutch lines in quite a short period of time. Murphy is an Irish actor who also does not speak Dutch, so odds are he did what actors often do in situations like this and learn their lines more or less phonetically, so they can get through the scene without having to learn an entire language. Fair enough. But what do we make of the fact that his Dutch was so bad and was left in the film that way? If we were being very generous, we could interpret this as a cutting criticism of Oppenheimer's arrogance, showing that he's not as smart as he thinks he is, foreshadowing his later downfall at the hands of the US state, courtesy in no small part of Lewis Strauss. But this just conflicts so much with what the cinematic language has been telling us that Oppenheimer is a special genius. It would be utterly bizarre to include such a subtle detail, to make such a massive statement about his character, knowing full well that most of his audience does not speak Dutch. Nobody in the Dutch crowd reacts to his bad Dutch. Nobody comments on it. The film explicitly guides us towards viewing his rapid acquisition of the language as something impressive and indicative of his intelligence.
You learned enough Dutch in 6 weeks to get a lecture on quantum mechanics.
I wanted to challenge myself.
We are given no reason to view any of this as a critique, unless we speak Dutch, which statistically we do not. And so, dumb guys writing smart guys just seems a lot more plausible. I'm being a bit trite, just calling him dumb. The problem with Nolan here is, frankly, he's British American, growing up in London and living a lot of his life in the US. He doesn't speak Dutch, and the messiness of Murphy's Dutch in the film prompts us to ask, did Nolan have a fluent Dutch speaker check his work before putting it into his multi-million-dollar film? Cillian Murphy mentioned receiving assistance from Dutch-Swedish cinematographer Hoyte van Hoytema, who surely could have told both of them how bad Murphy's Dutch was. The fact that Nolan went ahead with it anyway indicates a unique type of Anglosphere arrogance that allows us to just decide other languages don't really matter. Even when a major point of the scene, which characters keep commenting on, is how impressive it is that this character learned this language to reasonable fluency so quickly. But it might be a bit ungenerous to decry Nolan as an arrogant Westoid just because of this one detail. In truth, it's a small thing, but it stands out when you consider other ways Nolan is uncurious about Oppenheimer and details of his life, given how deeply empathetic and involved he is with Oppenheimer as a person. For example, Ops had a lot of association with communists. Now, I admit I was surprised to find that this film had one of the least anti-communist depictions of communists that I have ever seen in a Hollywood film. Low bar, to be honest, but they're shown to be pretty reasonable people who are often holding political positions far more humane than those of the US government. This is perhaps best exemplified by their support for the Republicans in the Spanish Civil War in their fight against the fascist Franco regime. A regime which, and the film does not shy away from this, the US government was supporting. Nolan seems to toe the same line that American Prometheus does, that Oppie was a progressive, New Deal liberal who just happened to be so wise and open-minded that he didn't mind all the radical politics from people in his personal life. I'm gonna say this plainly, Oppenheimer was probably a communist, at least at one point. I'm not just saying this because he was involved in union organizing. I'm not just saying this because he also sent money to the Spanish Republicans via the Communist Party, although all of that could already be used to make a reasonable case. I'm saying it because his wife was a card-carrying member of the Communist Party. So was his brother. So was Jean Tatlock, the woman he had an affair with, quite prominently in the film. And given his associations and his political activity, this guy was a communist. And that's before even getting into the fact that if he wasn't, all those communists in his life definitely would have annoyed him out of their lives, years before the Manhattan Project even started. Oh, and in the film, he claims to have read all 3 volumes of Marx's Capital, you know, like you do when you're not a communist. But the film, committed to keeping Oppenheimer ideologically unaligned, gives us a tremendous scene.
It's turgid stuff. There's some thinking ownership is theft.
Jean Tatlock says,
"Property, not ownership."
To which Oppenheimer responds,
I'm sorry, I read it in the original German.
Epic own, right? Fake American communoid dunked on. But there's a small problem. Property or ownership is theft? Marx never said that. Worse than that, in a letter criticizing Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, a foundational anarchist thinker, Marx attacks him for saying property is theft, on the basis that theft presupposes a violation of property rights. What Marx is saying here is by framing the private property held by capitalists as something they stole from the rest of us, Proudhon is targeting his critique at the distribution of property rather than property itself in the way that his slogan might lead you to believe. A Marxist would say the issue is not that property is distributed unequally, it is the economic system by which that property is produced and distributed in the first place. So to attribute this statement to Marx is not only factually incorrect, it shows a total lack of understanding of the very basics of Marxist ideas. And this is why I can't give Nolan the benefit of the doubt on the Dutch thing, because Oppenheimer isn't the only one getting this wrong. So does card-carrying Communist Party member Jean Tatlock. In his epic Too Smart for Marxism scene, Oppenheimer and Tatlock are discussing something Marx never said and explicitly did not agree with. There is really no plausible way to read this scene as anything but a mistake. And back to my accusations of Anglosphere arrogance by Nolan, this is the epitome of that kind of mentality. American and British liberals are bizarrely convinced, without ever reading a word the man wrote, that they understand and are smarter than Marxism. So much so that when putting a critique of communist interpretations of Marx's work in, again, a multi-million-dollar film, Nolan and co. apparently felt no need to, just real quick, Google Karl Marx property is theft, which would have swiftly revealed their terrible mistake. I am reminded a bit of the time Jordan Peterson rocked up to a debate against allegedly Marxist academic Slavoj Žižek about Marxism without even reading the Communist Manifesto. It's about 20 pages. Given his language skills and the strong possibility that Oppie may have been a communist, or at least was definitely well acquainted with communism, I do not doubt that he would have been reading Marx in the original German, and he simply wouldn't have made a mistake like this. But a liberal director from arguably two of the most anti-communist places on Earth, he would. Before the Cold War, with the interests of the American state and those of many communists seemingly aligned in defeating the Nazis, supporting the American war effort and being a communist or sympathetic to communism were not considered as mutually exclusive as they might be today. And Oppenheimer was all in for the American state. Albert Einstein, featuring in the film as a perpetually disappointed father figure to Oppenheimer, identified this problem himself, saying, "The trouble with Oppenheimer is that he loves a woman who doesn't love him, the United States government." Oppenheimer was often at odds with the more jingoistic factions of American politics, but he always fell in line. Little more than a week after the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, he called for international regulation of atomic weapons and cooperation with the Soviets to this end in order to avoid an arms race, like the one that happened. To which Secretary of State James F. Burns responded, "Lol, Lamau." And the American nuclear weapons program was set to rapidly expand. And Oppenheimer, he fell in line. Publicly, at least. I can't help but draw a parallel between the development of the atomic bomb and the expansion of the security state during the War on Terror. We were told these new agencies that could monitor and collect information on us with a startling lack of restriction or oversight were temporary, just until the threat was gone. Since, for example, the TSA was established in the wake of 9/11 more than 20 years ago, there has been very little political interest in getting rid of it. Some provisions of the Patriot Act technically expired in 2020, despite the act initially being introduced on the premise that it would be around for a far, far shorter term before being renewed by subsequent presidents from both parties. But many of the powers it introduced are just still in place, some with superficial changes at best. For example, the NSA can no longer collect and hold mass phone data, but it can simply request them from the private companies that do hold them, making very little functional difference. Oh, and it can still collect data outside the United States, where most people on Earth live. The powers that were extended to the state for what some would call a justifiable reason, preventing a repeat of an event that killed thousands of people, simply became part of the state apparatus, with no real mechanism for handing those powers back other than the generosity of our political leaders. Wouldn't hold my breath on that one. Likewise, the bomb was initially pitched as a weapon to defeat the Nazis, to stop the Holocaust. Hard to argue with that. It's difficult to think of a better reason to create a weapon. But what happens after the war? When the United States, rapidly becoming the most powerful nation on Earth at this point, still has the bomb. When the justification for the new weapon or power is gone, that weapon or power does not magically vanish with it. Barton Bernstein traces the evolution of Oppenheimer's perspective on the bomb following the bombing of Japan and the ending of the war. And what emerges is a pattern of toothless, private disagreement with full compliance in the public eye. Regarding the hydrogen bomb, which Oppenheimer famously opposed, he made public statements supporting it, insisting that nothing should stand in the way of scientific progress, while privately campaigning against it to impede scientific progress. This behavior is captured effectively in the film, which depicts Oppie's meeting with President Truman, in which he laments that he has blood on his hands, and according to his own account, Truman's unsympathetic response is pretty much exactly how that played out. In 1947, Oppenheimer served on the General Advisory Committee of the newly founded Atomic Energy Commission, where Oppenheimer later stated, unhappily, that the principal job of the commission was to provide atomic weapons, and good atomic weapons, and many atomic weapons. Even after Truman declared that the US would pursue the development of the hydrogen bomb, Oppenheimer fell in line. It was political disagreements and internal suspicion due to his frequent verbal opposition to the bomb that contributed to the loss of his security clearance and his ostracization. He never actually took a stand, never actually refused to progress the aims of the US military. But he was politically influential and not completely ideologically on board, so he was discarded. There's a beautiful symmetry in the film where Strauss, responsible for a lot of the political damage done to Oppenheimer, is himself consumed and destroyed by a system that does not hesitate to dispose of people as soon as they've ceased to be useful. But for Oppenheimer, we're left with a question: why didn't he quit? The film might leave some viewers with the idea that shortly after the bombing, Oppenheimer was overcome with guilt and either resigned or made some brave stand against the American state that prompted them to launch their extremely dubious investigation. But these events were about a decade apart, truncated by the structure of the film, which plays these two distinct periods of his life alongside each other. During that time, as we've seen, Oppenheimer would repeatedly adhere to the directions of the US government, no matter how strongly he personally disagreed with them. And it's not like Oppie was some poor conscript who couldn't go home if he wanted to. This was a man in an influential, prestigious position. He wasn't hurting for money or connections. He could have walked away. Why didn't he? Some have simply attributed this to a desire to stay in a position of influence, too in love with his proximity to power to walk away from it. Although this does make his frequent formal declarations against the decisions of the powerful somewhat puzzling, especially given that these did eventually get him into a lot of trouble. Maybe he was just foolish. There is another explanation, one that is thematically consistent with the film's ideas about even brilliant men being used and discarded by powerful entities like the state, but is largely omitted from the movie. Aside from the creation of the bomb itself, perhaps the most famous thing Oppenheimer did in his life was recite that now well-known passage from the Bhagavad Gita in a televised interview in 1965, towards the end of his life.
Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds.
It's a powerful moment, with Oppenheimer seemingly on the verge of tears, eyes cast downward as he contemplates his life, his work, and the world he helped create, a world racked with fears of nuclear annihilation at the height of the Cold War. So, when watching Oppenheimer, you might expect to see some depiction of this iconic interview, but instead we got this.
Read this.
In a truly baffling scene, Oppenheimer is having his infamous affair with Jean Tatlock, and in the middle of sex, she stops to pull a copy of the Gita off Oppie's shelf and asks him to read some of it to her while they have sex. And he does, comically reciting that famous quote during. Now, it's hard to read this scene as anything but a pointed rejection of the expectation that this famous moment in question should be included in the film. Nolan seems to be declaring that this moment is not as important to understanding Oppenheimer as a person as we might think. Indeed, by never returning to the Gita, the film depicts Oppie's interest in it less as a fundamental spiritual guide that contextualizes how he thinks, and more as a party trick that he uses to impress hot communist dames. Women love when you know your Sanskrit. The Bhagavad Gita is a 700-verse Hindu scripture that makes up part of the Mahabharata. The Gita is often considered the most influential of the Hindu texts, and in reality, it was something that Oppenheimer took very seriously, calling it the most beautiful philosophical song existing in any known tongue. Oppie studied Sanskrit in 1933 under Professor Arthur W. Ryder at Berkeley. His well-worn personal copy of the Gita is still kept in a museum, and you'll note it was translated by the guy who he learned Sanskrit from. Ops wasn't messing around. He was notorious for gifting copies of the book to friends, and was known to discuss and read the Gita and other Hindu texts very frequently. He even cited it as one of the books that most shaped his life. So let's do what Nolan didn't, and think a little more about the Gita. James Heggia notes that Oppenheimer was not raised in a Hindu tradition, and his reading of the Gita may be imperfect. But Oppenheimer's interest in Hindu scripture was too in-depth and too well documented to be dismissed as some lazy Orientalist fascination, though there was a bit of that going around at the time. What I am about to say is not an absolute statement on the Gita or its meaning, but an assessment of how Robbie Opps interpreted and used parts of that text. So, that famous quote, what does it actually mean? Prince Arjuna is grappling with his uncertainty about participating in a destructive war. The god Krishna reveals its divine form to Arjuna, to which he responds with terror. The terror of divine power, the terror of warfare. I see our warriors and all the kings are passing into your fiery jaws. All creatures rush to their destruction like moths into a flame, filled with your terrible radiance. O Vishnu, the whole of creation bursts into flames. Arjuna asks Krishna, who are you? To which Krishna replies, I am become death, destroyer of worlds. Just as Oppenheimer recounted, though some translations say time rather than death, the point is the inevitability. In the next verse, Krishna makes this clear. Even without your participation, all the warriors gathered here will die. I have already slain all these warriors. You will only be my instrument. Arjuna is being told that this terrible violence will happen, with or without him. But other parts of the Gita stress the importance of fulfilling your dharma, acting in accordance with your role. Arjuna is a warrior. It is his role to fight in wars. Therefore, it is right of him to participate in this violence, despite his personal misgivings. This is not a belief I hold, but Oppenheimer's behavior strongly suggests that he did. Oppenheimer would try to distance himself from the bombing, asserting that he just did the work of a scientist. All he did was make something, and it was on the US military how they used it. He was simply fulfilling his duty, his role, playing his part in this greater whole. The only trouble is, that's bullshit. He did a lot more than make the bomb. The film depicts a meeting in which Oppenheimer is in the room helping decide where to drop the bomb. I had to check that this was real, and it 100% is. He didn't just hand the bomb over to the military and leave it to them to decide how to use it. He helped them make the decision to drop the bomb on 2 major civilian centers. He even advised them of the exact height to detonate over Hiroshima for maximum destruction. Something interesting about the film is how little it narrativizes at times. This scene recontextualizes all of Oppenheimer's rationalizations for his actions. It turns him from a passive observer to an active participant in these bombings, even ignoring the fact that he led the project to make the bomb. And some of you who saw the movie might not have even remembered that short scene happened before I mentioned it. That's what makes Oppie's deployment of this just following orders rhetoric so interesting. He's not on trial at Nuremberg. If anything, much of the country is lauding him as a hero after the war. Why cope like this? Why downplay your own involvement so intensely? Because he is guilty. It seems like that story about Prince Arjuna didn't help when the reality of those thousands of charred corpses of shadows burned into the pavement, of generations forced to bear the scars of his invention, started to sink in. Historian Michel Roux once mused, "One wonders what would have happened if Oppenheimer had firmly opposed the atomic bombardment of Japanese cities. Would it have taken place or not?" But he didn't. He treated this outcome as inevitable, washing his hands of moral responsibility as if he didn't help pull the trigger personally. In his fascination with the Gita, Oppenheimer found a way of framing his own actions to himself that made them feel justifiable. He was just fulfilling his role in a machine that would have kept on rolling forward with or without him. Notably, this clashes with the cinematic language of Nolan's film that repeatedly tells us he is a unique and special boy, and they couldn't have done this without him. To be clear, they probably could have. Some of the greatest scientific minds of the time were working on the Manhattan Project, supported by the immense resources of the American state. But that's not the story Nolan wanted to tell, so it's not surprising that so little attention is given to how Oppenheimer justified his actions to himself. The Gita is not discussed at all. Importantly, in that famous clip, when Oppie says the thing, he says that, at the time, that was how he and the others on the project felt. He is not saying he feels that way at the time he is speaking, near the end of his life. Nolan does a fantastic job depicting how expendable even a great and special genius like Oppenheimer can be once their usefulness to power has exhausted itself. All the sacrifice and contesting with his own morals in service of a state that threw him away, as soon as he'd given them what they wanted. A lesson thoroughly established in Strauss's story, as his role in destroying the reputation of the dissident Oppenheimer saw him rewarded only with the destruction of his own career. But in neglecting to interrogate the meaning behind Oppenheimer's deployment of the Gita, the film misses a key personal parallel to that very same dynamic. There are so many stories we can tell ourselves, so much cope, that we can use to talk ourselves into doing terrible things, into aiding institutions that bring unbelievable death and destruction into the world. It's okay that your engineering degree resulted in you working on drones. Maybe they'll be used to deliver packages rather than annihilate weddings and hospitals. It's okay for you to become a cop. You'll be one of the good ones. The institutional culture and risk of losing your job if you don't do certain things definitely won't affect you at all. And even if you do find yourself brutalizing some kid for shoplifting, good thing it's you doing it and not some violent racist, right? We can tell ourselves we're different or just following orders, and despite the Nuremberg trials supposedly banishing that justification forever, people still use it all the time. It's kind of what Prince Arjuna in that passage is doing, just following orders, just playing their role in this greater historical motion that is going to do the awful thing anyway. And that cope can get us through the job, through those terrible acts. But following Oppenheimer's life makes it clear. Just as we ensure our own destruction by handing new weapons or powers over to the state without asking, what about tomorrow and the next day? Those stories we tell ourselves to justify our participation in systems of violence will do nothing afterwards to help us live with what we've done.